Well, welcome everyone to this edition of Econ Talk, streaming live on CGTN's digital platforms. I'm Michael Wong. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Mr. John Wilmoth, Director of the Population Division of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Now, John has extensive knowledge and expertise in the intersection of demographic trends in economic development. He is also Professor Emeritus at the Department of Demography at the University of California at Berkeley. Now, in our conversation today, we'll discuss the current state and future projections of population growth and how it relates to the global economy. We will also explore the challenges and opportunities in China presented by demographic changes and how these changes may impact economic outcomes. So, John, welcome to Econ Talk.
Thank you.
My first question for you, John, is, of course, the UN recently projected in a report that India is poised to overtake China as the most populous nation this month. And the news, of course, has garnered a lot of spotlight and attention. So tell us more about the report and the key findings about China first.
Well, the report is really just following up on our the UN estimates and projections of global population that we published last year in July of 2022, those are our latest estimates where we gathered together all the data available in the world and map out the trends for individual countries. And there's a lot of data that goes into that, historical information going back to the 1950s. And we track the trends of these populations over time. And we've all grown up learning that China was the largest country in the world in terms of population, and now that's changing. The India's population is expected to reach 1.426 billion people this month, and at that point, it's going to reach and then surpass the population of mainland China. For China, what's been going on is that the population reached its peak size just recently and experienced a decline in 2022. And we expect that decline will continue due to the very low birth rate in China. And it's possible that the population will fall to under 1 billion people by the end of the century.
So, John, having that demographic dividend should be a positive for economic growth and development. You were telling me earlier this could be a tailwind, definitely, for growth. But some point out that relying just on population growth alone to drive the economy is not optimal. What are your thoughts on this argument?
Well, certainly demographic change is only one component of what drives economic growth. And this demographic dividend it refers to a specific period over the course of what we call the demographic transition. The demographic transition is the shift to longer lives and smaller families that all populations in the world are going through. They're at different stages. Some have completed the transition, some are in the middle of it, some are just starting. But this transition leads to, it causes a period of rapid population growth because the death rate tends to come down before the birth rate, and then that causes growth as more people survive, especially as more children survive premature mortality. They survive to adulthood, they have children of their own, that kind of propels growth. So it's the reduction in mortality that causes the growth, and then it's the reduction of the fertility rate eventually that brings growth to a close. And that happened quite a while back in China with the reduction of fertility 50 years ago, really. It's a process that started driven partly by government policies, but also by socioeconomic changes that were taking place. So the fertility rate came down, the growth came to a halt, the population size started to decline last year. And another piece of this transition is that the population becomes older. As we extend lifespan, as people live to older ages, that gives us more older people. And then as we reduce the birth rate, that means there are fewer younger people being added to the population every year. So that gradually then shifts the age distribution towards older ages. And the demographic dividend that we refer to it's a period of accelerated growth in GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita, which happens because of an increase in the relative size of the working age population. That's to say, if the working age population is some percentage of the total, but that percentage is going up over time, that helps to drive growth of gross domestic product per capita. So it increases personal income, average personal incomes. It provides a little boost to it. It's a tailwind. It's not a determining factor. It's just one of many factors that helps to drive change over time. And the thing is, for China, that period has actually passed. I was just able to confirm the size of the working age population is now falling slightly from year to year. So it's actually a headwind in terms of what the demographic change is bringing to economic growth right now. That's to say, as the relative size of the working age population is going down, that creates a little negative impact on growth of personal income, on average personal income. So, but it's one of many things. It's not, the demographic dividend is something that many people have emphasized because it tends to happen at a point when countries are starting to develop rapidly. And China has gone through that over the last 30 or 40 years and has benefited from the demographic dividend. In fact, it's estimated that between 15 and 25% of the growth in GDP per capita between 1982 and 2000 has been attributed to the demographic dividend. That's to say, the increasing size of the working age population as a fraction of the total population. So there are different estimates from different researchers, but it's not everything, but it's a substantial piece of the growth in GDP per capita between 15 and 25% over those 2 decades. And then I think it's continued for a couple of decades after that, but it's essentially now reached a point where the working age population is actually decreasing as a proportion of the total. And therefore, it's really more of a headwind than a tailwind.
John, I might come back to the working age population number in just a second, but like you mentioned, this demographic dividend can definitely be a crucial factor in terms of providing this period of increased productivity and economic growth due to a higher proportion of working age individuals relative to, say, dependents in the non-working age population. And China has recently pointed to its talent dividend, referring to the higher education levels of its massive labor force. What do you think are the implications of the talent dividend for China's economic development and growth going forward?
Well, this is always part of the discussion around the demographic dividend, and this is one of those other factors that weighs very heavily. It's not just the demography, but it's also policies that influence the ability, the potential productivity of each worker, which depends on their level of education, it depends on their level of health. And so, countries that invest, like China has invested very heavily in the health and the education of the population. And yes, I believe this has been a very important factor that has helped to drive growth in the Chinese economy over the past several decades. There are many ways that this shows up. Obviously, the more educated workers are able to be more productive. They're better able to engage with modern technologies and to take advantage of those to increase the productivity, the amount of output per worker. So productivity is really key, and productivity depends a lot on education and health.
Yeah.
And that's not just the age structure of the population that drives things. It's also the investment that's made in the human capital of the population. And by human capital, we mean especially education and healthcare.
Yeah. So you mentioned the working age population, John, because despite the demographic shifts, we do see China's working age population still quite large. So you mentioned that working age population is decreasing, but it stands at nearly 900 million people still. And that's more than the working age populations of all developed countries combined. We see sort of this phenomenon, I feel, in many developing countries. They share similar characteristics in terms of a large population, in terms of a large working age population within the total population, increasing education levels, leading to better quality workforces as well. So I want to focus a little bit more on China. So given China's working age population right now, its current national conditions and development stage, what does China, you think, need to prioritize right now to further unleash that talent dividend? You mentioned healthcare, you mentioned investments in education. Obviously, this needs to be a combination when it comes to a policy basket. But as it stands right now for China's current development stage, what do you think the country needs to prioritize a little bit more on relative to the other factors in terms of further unleashing the power of its workforce?
Well, I think you could mention several things. One is to think about the age range over which people work. You know, what is our definition of the working age range? As life expectancy has gone up, I think we need to adjust our understanding of what is the normal age range for work. Currently in China, I understand that the retirement ages are 60 years for men, 55 for women if they're in white collar jobs, and 50 for women who are in blue collar jobs. And you know, life expectancy in 2022 reached 78 years in China. And this is quite a bit higher, 15 years higher than it was in 1978 when these age criteria were set. So, you know, there's the one in terms of total productivity of the population, increasing the expectations about how long people would work before taking retirement. I don't know. I'm not so familiar with the pension system in China to know to what groups of people that applies those retirement ages. So, of course, that would matter too. I mean, how many people are kind of falling under that pension system? If you change it, it would have more or less effect depending on how many people are involved. Another issue has to do with, you know, regularizing the population. There's this issue of rural residents who live in urban areas who don't have proper documents under the hukou system, where they, 64% of the population of China lives in urban areas, but only 45% hold an urban hukou. So, this is a problem of, a group of people who basically they're living in urban areas, they're working, they're contributing to the economy, and yet they don't have access to certain basic services because they don't have the proper registration as an urban resident. And so, I mean, this is a question of social welfare and protection of that population, but it's also it's part of the issue of the health and well-being of the population and the human capital. It's not good to have a group that kind of exists without all the social benefits and the rights and privileges that other groups have, just by the nature of the administrative arrangements that don't register the people as proper urban residents.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are various things that can be said. It's certainly important to continue what China has been doing very effectively, which is investing in the health and education of the population, increasing opportunities for people to participate in the labor force, whether it's women or whether it's older people. But again, China's done very well in terms of labor force participation of women. It has a high level of engagement in the workforce by women. So, it's been doing many of the right things, but I would say keep doing those, of course.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question. I'm still trying to think what other things we might mention in this area.
Yeah.
But
it does.
we'll leave it at that for now.
I totally agree in terms of further strengthening the social safety net. I mean, smaller families, I think, also helps in terms of more women participating in the workforce. And just a quick note on the hukou reform. I think China's policymakers, they understand that, and that's why we see hukou reform constantly in action here in this country as well, especially for some of the countries that more medium-sized and smaller cities. We have a lot of hukou reform, relaxing of hukou restrictions as well. I think the concern for larger urban areas is that there's just too many people in these large urban centers. For example, Beijing, 20 million plus people, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, 20 million plus people. So I think policymakers are considering how do we make sure people have equal opportunity in these large cities, and make sure that services can actually reach such a massive amount of population in these huge urban centers Hukou reform, a work in progress, but I think we're definitely seeing that progress here in China as well. John, we know that China has long been preparing for changes in its demographic structure as well. Policymakers, I think, have keyed in and zoomed in on this quite early, and efforts include, we see this acceleration in terms of an innovation-driven economy. We see boosting automation in factories, for example, as well. We see increasing investments in education, like we said. So this maybe move away from a more labor-intensive economy to a more technology and knowledge-intensive economy. Have you been sort of maybe tracking the progress of China's transition? So maybe in your view, how has this transition progressed so far? And how would you assess what China has done to really ensure that demography does not become destiny?
Well, that's a difficult question. I don't know if I have a comprehensive answer to that. There's clearly, an important issue now of China is trying to kind of upgrade its industrial base to make it more high technology oriented and so forth. And therefore, necessarily it becomes a less labor intensive manufacturing oriented economy. And many of the manufacturing jobs, the lower skilled manufacturing jobs have been moving to other countries, even from China. I mean, originally they moved to China, now they're moving away from China to places like India, Vietnam. But China's making the transition that it should be making toward the higher value, high-end production types of activities that are more profitable in the end and that make use of the highly educated workforce that the country has. So I think, we see that kind of movement toward higher end activities in the economy, and we see the offshoring of some of the lower skilled labor to other countries, and that's really the natural progression of things, and I think China's moving in the right direction in that sense.
And I'm wondering, John, if the natural progression of things is also, we see a lot more rural workers moving into urban centers. I was reading an article by Dr. Cai Fang, who is the chief expert at China's leading think tank, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And he was pointing out that still China's rural workforce accounts for around 23.5% of the country's total workforce. And that number is substantially higher compared to the 3% average level that we see in higher income economies. And Dr. Cai believes that a portion of China's rural workforce can still move into other industries in the country's urbanization process. How do you see China's urbanization process affecting its labor force structure? How much more room is there for rural workers to still move into China's urban centers, you think?
Well, I think, there has been a big shift towards urban living. I think it's gone from around 20% urban, that China was approximately 20% urban in 1980 to about 64% in 2020. So that's a huge shift over just 40 years. And we expect, at least the projection that we have shows it going up to about 70% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. So there's still some movement. There's still some room for movement towards higher levels of urbanization. I guess the question is whether the industrial base is shifting in such a way towards high-end activities that may not provide jobs for lower skilled laborers from rural areas who come to the cities, whether there will be the jobs to support them. I think that's the question I have. I don't really know the answer. So whether there's really a possibility for massive rural to urban migration in search of jobs is a little bit unclear, given the shift in the economy that's taking place and the shift of jobs that's taking place to some other developing countries, more of the low-skilled jobs. So again, as the economy shifts, the key thing is to keep up with that in terms of education, so that it becomes a more high-tech economy with an educated workforce. And that's really the best place to be in the long run.
Yeah, so really investing even more in education. What about vocational education, John? I mean, I'm assuming that needs to be an important part, not just for China, but for any developing economy with a large working age population.
Yes.
Vocational education is also going to be key.
Yes, I think that's right. And it was one thing I was thinking to mention earlier when you were asking, what's necessary now to keep China on the right path. I mean, vocational education is one thing. I mean, giving different career paths for people is one aspect, but then there's also the issue of lifelong learning and continuing to be educated, to educate people over the life course as people live so much longer. And if they're going to be working for longer, if we talk about raising the retirement age, or it's not just a question of raising the retirement age and forcing people to work more. It's also a question of opening up opportunities for people to work more so that we're not pushing people out of the labor market at a certain age. But if that's going to be the case and people are going to have longer work lives, then that just increases the necessity of having some system investment in lifelong learning so that people can keep up with the changing technology. I mean, I don't know about you, but I have trouble keeping up. Just everything, every time I open my computer, there's new software and I mean, so people need to kind of keep up on the latest tools and technologies. And it's a challenge, frankly. I think it's a challenge for anyone to keep up with the pace of technological change that we have. And so with longer lives and longer working lives, societies really need to look at this issue of lifelong learning and creating systems. I think most countries don't have any kind of regular systems to make sure that people have opportunities to continue being educated as they grow older. I mean, you can piece it together from here and there, but it's no kind of regular system like we have to educate children.
Yeah, I totally agree. You got to be a lifelong learner, John, and guilty as charged. It's very difficult for me, I feel, sometimes to keep up with the pace of technological advances. I'm wondering if we have ways to maybe increase the productivity and efficiency of people who want to just stay in the countryside, rural workers in general, because perhaps in many developing economies around the world, you have that large rural workforce, and it might be difficult to change that ratio between an urban and rural workforce. So are there measures that governments and societies can undertake to make sure that rural workforce is as productive as possible? Because there are still about 500 million people that live in China's countryside, and some of them just want to stay in the countryside increasingly. And we also see a trend where people in urban areas want a change of lifestyle, and they're increasingly moving to the countryside as well. So how do we make sure that rural workforce is as productive as possible?
Well, certainly, I think you're talking more about the first group, the group that's staying in the rural areas rather than the urbanites who are moving to the rural areas because now they can work remotely. But I mean, as far as the workers who have been in the rural areas, and I mean, I think governments need to look carefully at their industrial policies to make sure that they're investing in rural development as well as in urban areas. You know, the cities tend to get all the attention and most of the money from governments. So it's important to balance that if you want to have a viable, a healthy rural economy. And so it's investing in that economy and trying to facilitate, industries that can succeed in that context, but then also establishing the links to the urban economy and making sure that the rural economy is well integrated. It's not easy to do, but it can be done. It requires policies that focus on that and emphasize the importance of rural development as well as urban.
Okay. So let me ask you then about China's massive initiative called rural revitalization, John, because when you talk about the rural economy for many parts of the world, again, there's a large number of people that still live in the countryside. So what China is trying to do when it comes to rural development is to ensure that maybe villages, townships, counties, these smaller administrative units, they find a local industry that is suitable based on their local conditions. They find, for example, a local crop, maybe a local fruit or vegetable that is specifically grown in that area. And then based on China's logistics system, for example, e-commerce, live streaming can really market, brand, and distribute this product to all across the country and take advantage of China's massive consumer market That's number one. So developing local industries, the importance of that for rural development and the rural workforce. And also this sort of integration between the first, secondary, and tertiary industries in the rural economy, and having more balanced development and coordinated development between rural and urban areas. What do you think about these practices for the rural workforce?
Well, it's not something where I'm an expert, and I can only say that I think it sounds like it makes a lot of sense. If the objective is to have a healthy, vibrant rural economy as well, certainly take advantage of the things that you have going. I mean, if there's an opportunity to grow a particular crop or engage in a particular extractive industry of some sort because the resource is there, that only makes sense. But then creating the links between that and the rest of the economy, and then having a balanced approach where you emphasize the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors of the economy, all of that makes sense to me. I can't say that I'm an expert, though, and I can't really reflect on it in a more intelligent way, perhaps. But
So let me zoom back then a little bit and take a look at the bigger picture, John. So if you look around the world, what would you say are some of the best practices for dealing with falling fertility rates in aging societies, and ensure that in the process we can still have a relatively vibrant economy that can be positioned for future growth and development?
Well, a lot of countries have taken an interest in this matter of low fertility, because many countries now have fertility levels that are below what we call the replacement level, which is about 2.1 births per woman over a lifetime. That's enough to replace the parent generation and essentially to have a stable population over the long run in the absence of migration. And that's in a population with low levels of mortality. So basically, most countries today, except the least developed, have low enough levels of mortality that what we need is about 2.1 births per woman in order to have population stability over time in the absence of migration. But we're now in a situation where 2/3 of the world's population lives in countries that are below that level. So, and it just keeps increasing. The number of countries that keep getting added to that list, the number continues to grow. Recently, India was added to that list of countries with birth rates that are now below 2.1 births per woman over a lifetime. So more and more parts of the world are becoming interested in this because they're seeing the impacts of this low fertility. Some countries have extremely low levels of fertility, or we talk about very low levels of fertility. Anything below 1.5 children per woman over a lifetime is very low fertility. China is down around 1.2 in recent years. Some countries like Korea and Singapore have fallen below 1 child per woman on average. So in these situations, countries have tried many different policies to try and raise the birth rate, which essentially amounts to helping parents to manage the challenges of childbearing, child rearing, and market work. Being actively engaged in the labor force, and being a good worker and being a good family person at the same time. So, I mean, some examples: Sweden is very well known for its generous family policies, which include subsidized childcare and parental leave and flexible work hours to help people manage the challenges of being a parent and a worker. They've encouraged women to have children while they're also pursuing their careers. But then, Sweden also has a high immigration rate, which has helped to counterbalance its aging population. So I think, there's more than one policy to be considered if you're concerned about the extremes of demographic change. And I think that's really what we need to be concerned with, are the extreme cases. Populations, all populations are going to age. We can't avoid population aging. But the concern is when it's happening very fast and when it's going to kind of extreme levels, where you have eventually, like for Japan, the older population has grown to such a large fraction of the total because of the very low birth rate over several decades. And that's where China is headed too, because it's had this very low birth rate over quite a while. So the key policy responses in this situation are helping people to have the number of children that they want to have, because many surveys have shown in various countries that have these very low levels of fertility, they've shown that people would actually prefer to have more children than they're having. Sometimes in high fertility contexts, we find that women are having more children than they want to have because they don't know how to stop. They don't have access to contraceptive methods, and there's cultural pressures on them to have lots of children. So they end up having more than they may want.
Yeah.
And in very low fertility settings, we often find that people are having fewer children than what they want. And it's this question of balancing work and family obligations. And so policies that somehow help parents to do that. And I think, childcare, subsidized childcare is really key. I think it's probably the most important of all of these. Parental leave is fine, giving them some time off around the time of birth or following the birth. Flexible work hours actually is another one that I think that's very important, because it's an ongoing issue that helps people to manage the challenges of raising children while working full time. So then there are cash incentives that some governments have tried, like a baby bonus. We give you $2,000 if you have another child, something like that. These can help, but they tend to be more temporary impacts. It's the things that matter the most are the ones that affect people's everyday lives and help them in the everyday task of raising children. So subsidized childcare and flexible working hours, I think flexible work arrangements those are probably the most important. But that's on the side of kind of helping people to have the number of children that they want to have, which is probably going to raise the birth rate in many populations. But then there's another policy area that's worth considering is migration. And I think this is an area where China has relatively little experience, but many countries have, effectively used migration as a way to counter the trend toward population aging. It doesn't reverse the trend at all. It just maybe slows it down or reduces the level or cuts off some of the extreme situation in some countries that might otherwise be aging very rapidly. But because of immigration, which tends to bring in people who are relatively younger, it counters some of that move toward population aging, at least temporarily.
Yeah. Well, John, all great points. I want to end on sort of a positive note. We're a little bit short on time, but I want to squeeze this one final question in, because the United Nations says that falling birth rates do not spell disaster. There might be a narrative these days that if you have falling fertility rates, that could lead to national catastrophe, population collapses, and perhaps, right, in the extreme cases that you mentioned. But could you maybe just comment on that statement by the United Nations saying that falling birth rates do not spell national disaster? If you could expand on that just a little bit more for us.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency with population trends, whether we're talking about population growth or population aging, the disaster narratives are just unusually popular. It's a little inexplicably popular, we might say. It's as though no matter what happens with the population, people find some way to make it a disaster. And of course, they're not all disasters. They seem like population trends seem like huge changes, because they are in some ways. They're really fundamental changes in terms of the size of the population or the age distribution. And these things shape our world in very fundamental ways. But human beings are incredibly adaptable. And I think this is what's often lost in the conversation about demographic change and what's the impact going to be. People find ways to live in different situations, different population settings, with a larger population or a smaller population, higher density, lower density, a more aged world, a younger world. People make all kinds of adjustments, like some of the things we've been talking about, shifting the expectations about when people will stop working, for example. That's an adaptation that can take place slowly over time. You kind of gradually increase the age at which people pull out of the labor force. And that has an enormous impact in terms of keeping the productive capacity of the economy large enough to take care of the growing older population. So it's it doesn't need to be a disaster if the necessary and sensible adjustments are made in the way that we live and the way that we organize our economy as the population grows older.
Yeah. Fantastic insights there as well, John. Actually, I do want to ask one more question, and I guarantee this will be the final question, and that is about youth employment. So what advice would you give to young people these days entering the workforce, especially as we see this rapid rise of technology? Some young people may have some jitters about the future of work. What advice would you give to young people these days entering the workforce in terms of what they should do to find that meaningful, purposeful, mission-driven work for their entire careers?
Wow, I would say probably one of the most important things is to be adaptable and to be ready for change. I don't think you can anticipate where your career is going to be like when you're 20 or 25 years old. I don't think you should try and imagine what your career is going to be like, what work you're going to be doing in 20 years, because so many things are going to change between now and then. So I would say, I've always said it's very important to be well educated in terms of your ability to speak and write. Your verbal communication is extremely important, and so is math. And everything else kind of derives from those two. If you can communicate well, to get educated, to become a good communicator, and to know how to do basic math and even advanced math, because everything else comes out of those two things. And so, being well educated will give you opportunities and allow you to adapt over time and to be resilient in the face of change. So I would say education is key, and be ready to adapt and be ready to change and be open to change as you go through life in terms of what you do. That would be my advice.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Be open to change, be resilient. I think those are going to be two key factors going forward. I don't know what you wanted to do when you were a child, John. I wanted to be an astronaut, and look where I ended up. I mean, I love my job, but the dream when I was a kid was, I don't know, flying a spaceship to Pluto or something. So yeah, definitely be open to changes in the environment that surrounds you. Okay, John, we're going to leave it there. Fascinating conversation, great insights. Thank you so much for joining us. John Wilmoth, Director of the Population Division at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And we certainly hope you, our viewers, have had a deeper understanding of population dynamics and how it relates to economic growth and development, and what societies can do to truly ignite the power of its labor force, whether you have a growing working age population or whether you have an aging population, because demography can, but do not have to be, a country's destiny if the correct policies are put in place. And that's going to do it for this edition of Econ Talk. I'm Michael Wong here in Beijing. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.